Equitable Education Initiative and Director of the Early Careers Scholars Program in New Civics, both of which are co-sponsoring this event. We're delighted to have Professor Hugh Lauder from the University of Bath, and the commentators are local heroes Schwartz and Murnane. So I'd like to start by introducing Hugh. I have to say, Hugh is a friend of mine, a colleague of mine from the University of Bath. I think we've known each other for what, 20 years?
20 years.
Just like back in the days. And Hugh was briefly visiting the States, so I would like him to come and talk about his exciting work on debt and capital, which, interestingly, Sarah Lawrence liked just in the very ominous title, which I think is appropriate. And let's say a bit about our speakers today. Hugh Lauder is Professor of Education and Political Economy at the University of Bath, and he's also Director of the Institute for Policy Research. He's studied at the University of London and the University of Canterbury in New Zealand, and he has been a dean at the Victoria University in Wellington. He specialises in the relationship of education to the economy and has for over 15 years worked on national skills strategies and more recently on the global skills strategies of multinational companies and their implications for graduate recruitment. Hugh is the author or editor of 9 books and of numerous research articles in this area. And he's also has been a visiting professor at the Institute of Education in London, at the University of Turku in Finland. He's currently a visiting professor at the University of Witwatersrand in South Africa. So he's indeed a very distinguished and very well known in his field. Our 2 commentators, whom I think you anyway know, but I will read about them too. Robert Schwartz is Professor of Practice Emeritus at the Harvard Graduate School of Education. Before he joined the Harvard faculty in 1996, he served in a variety of roles in education, including high school teacher and principal, education advisor to the Mayor of Boston, and to the Governor of Massachusetts. He was Assistant Director of the National Institute of Education, and various other long list of extremely impressive and distinguished roles. He's been very involved in activities around learning for jobs, successful reform, teaching talent, pathways to progress, is it? Yes. And he's been involved generally in issues around the future about reforming education to improve opportunities for young people. Richard Murnane, as an economist, is a Thomson Research Professor at HGSE and Research Associate of the National Bureau of Economic Research. With his colleague Greg Duncan, he's examined the respects in which the growth in family income inequality in the United States has affected educational opportunities for children from low-income families, and the effectiveness of alternative strategies for improving life chances for these children. He's had 2 particular major publications around this topic. One is With Opportunity and Restoring Opportunity, so he's again expert very much in the whole area of opportunity. And he's been looking recently at changes how the education system in Chile has influenced students' distribution and student achievement. So we have 3 very distinguished people to talk this afternoon, and I look forward very much to hearing from all of them. So thank you and welcome to Hugh.
Thanks, Helen. Put this down so I can see you, and you can see me, which makes it a little easier. Thanks to Helen. Thanks to you for that you've come. I'm delighted to be at Harvard, and I'm delighted to be here in the company of these 2 I don't quite heroes, I think Helen called them. I called them earlier. There's a British expression that younger people use, which is legends, and they really are, absolutely. And for them to come and discuss the issues I wish to raise today is terrific. I guess I should have a question mark, education and death of human capital, question mark. It shouldn't be quite so emphatic, I don't think. Because there's always a way out, perhaps. So let me then start by saying something in general about human capital and when I was thinking about this, there are many different ways of talking about ideas that dominate in a society. Discourse is the common way of discussing it these days, but I find discourse kind of a bit difficult. Ideology, it could be in the sense that it's one-sided, as Marx would put it, or not exactly reflecting reality in appropriate ways while reflecting power structures. But I think that the concept I want to use here is common sense, which is a Gramscian term. And it means, effectively, that the idea of human capital pervades the society and pervades a lot of the thought in a society, such as the United States, such as Britain, such as New Zealand and Australia, Canada. And it's been embraced by policymakers as the theory of the connection between education and the economy. And as we know, in this day and age, in these particular countries, the connection between education and the economy is seen as a major justification for education. And I want to raise some fundamental questions about that. At the same time, policymakers like the OECD keep banging the drum, despite all the evidence to the contrary, that I won't go into in great detail in this seminar, but I'm happy to in the question time. But banging the drum for human capital theory, if you look at their work, and particularly Education at a Glance, it is saturated with human capital assumptions. And I'll talk about what those assumptions are shortly. At the same time, parents and students also take a view which takes its cue, I think, from human capital theory, and that is the view that fundamentally you need a good education and good education qualifications to make your way in the labour market. And that was once true. Whether it was true in the way human capital theory describes it's another matter, but it once was true, and I want to throw some doubt on that as a claim for today myself. And that, of course, leaves parents and students in great difficulty. We are, I think, if I was to signal the kind of end point, is we are at a point, at an absolute turning point in understanding the role of education and its relationship not only to the economy, but the society. So let me just say a little bit about human capital theory. Human capital theory makes the following kinds of claims and assumptions. So it effectively says that, and I'm talking here about human capital theory in the orthodox or neoclassical form. There are many varieties of human capital theory, a lot of which don't subscribe to these particular assumptions I'm going to be discussing today, and we could also talk about them. However, it seems to me that this lies at the heart of many of the views that policymakers take. And so that's why I'm going to go through this now. So fundamentally, the view is that education can be seen as a form of human capital, in that those who invest in that education, and there are assumptions from neoclassical economics to believe that we're all calculating pleasure machines, as one economist put us. We calculate to maximize our utility. And one way of doing that in terms of education is to see it as an investment in generating the kind of capital that will lead to higher income in the labour market. However, and this is important, the assumption here is that you gain a higher income from your education because you are, as a person, more productive. So there's a connection between income and productivity. And the income is said to reflect the productivity. Now, let me just give you 2 sentences of history of the thinking behind this. There were 3 major theorists of human capital theory. Schwartz, who gave the address to the American Economics Association in 1960. And Schwartz was an interesting thinker and threw in a lot of caveats to a very wide-ranging account of the way in which we should understand human capital as explaining some of the extraordinary productivity in the post-war American era through education. Becker comes along and he casts this into a kind of neoclassical form, the form of the idea of markets reaching a certain kind of equilibrium and all the stuff that goes around that, which I don't want to go into today because I don't think it's entirely relevant in this particular case. So the important point, though, I think that policymakers picked up was that if you had more educated people who were more productive, employers would respond. This is crucial. Employers would respond by raising the job specs that they had to reflect the greater productivity potential of students leaving college and going into the world of work. And only last week I was in Oxford, and the chief economist for the Department for International Development said there and then in his opening remarks that the days of, he didn't call it human capital theory, that's what he was talking about, the days when we assumed that if we produced a supply of, increasing supply of well-educated people, that would increase the demand for them, those days are over. It just doesn't exist. May do in small limiting cases, but in general not. So what I want to do on the basis of that kind of brief description is say a little bit about the relationship between education and productivity, the meaning of productivity, and here I want to introduce notions of power, culture, and in particular in relation to gender, and the analysis given there. Have a look at some of the education and income data for the UK in the United States. And I want to do that because the assumption of human capital theory is that learning equals earning. And what I want to try and suggest is that that's not the case anymore, except for a particular group for whom they're very lucky. I then want to look at one of the other sides to human capital theory, particularly developed by Jacob Mintzer, which was that there are costs and benefits, and there are always costs to education, of getting an education, and there are major questions, as you well know, in the United States and in Britain now, about the costs of an education. And then I want to move on to another question, which is a question about, well, what do we actually mean by capital in human capital? And the reason I want to ask that question was because it was for so long taken for granted. And it has no longer been taken for granted. But in terms of trying to understand what that capital might be, there's been a divergence. There's a divergence between economists on the one hand and sociologists on the one hand, and the world of business, and especially transnational and big business on the other, in the way they understand the nature of human capital. So I want to have a look at that, and then I want to have a look at the key question, which is, but when I say I want to look at it, I'm going to throw it open at that stage more or less, because I think that if my analysis is roughly right, and it may not be, we shall find out in this discussion, but if it's roughly right, then it raises huge questions for how we're meant to understand education. So that's the outline of what I'm going to do. And much of this will, because it's now in the press, almost on a daily basis, be common to you. Since the 1980s, there's been the relationship between education and productivity and income is what I'm particularly interested in here. And it's the productivity-income connection, which is so central to human capital theory. What you see is that up to the late 70s, early 80s, there was a line where the two of income and productivity went up in parallel. And that's precisely what the human capital theorists thought. And there's a point here which is very important. They assumed that employers would employ people, and this follows from what I've just been saying, that employers would employ people in order to raise their productivity of their company, their firm, whatever, their business. But in order to do that, there's an expectation of merit, that they would choose people on merit in order for them to be more productive, therefore more efficient. And there's a bit of a spin-off here I want to come back to later, which is that says something about the issue of social mobility as well, and the basis of merit and social mobility. If you raise the education levels of people, if they are committed to a higher education, then the assumption was that they would be assured of gaining in terms of work on the basis of merit. So for that footnote, which I'll come back to, the link between productivity and income. It got broken, and we can see how here. And so up to, I've got to press this button now, up to around here, 73, it rises more or less in tandem. Oh, I was just about to shoot you with this laser. Sorry. And then after that, you see there's a divergence. And then there's a question about, well, why that divergence? And there are at least two candidate hypotheses about this. One is that the divergence is there because employers have had to pay for pensions, but it raises a question about why they have to pay for pensions. And certainly in Britain, in 2005, the employers went and raided the pension pots for their own benefit and their shareholders' benefit. But then the other point is this one, that what you see here is that increasingly these people here at the 95th percentile, their income or their is rising. And so in other words, one of the things that we may say, and if we've read Thomas Piketty, as I'm sure many of you might have done, then we know that there is a very interesting claim there about the rising polarization of income and wealth, in his case. And then there's a further rather depressing theory that he's got about the fact that that's the normal state of capitalism rather than the golden age of the 50s and 60s when there was a greater levelling of income. So, first of all then, there's a question about, in a social sense, in a societal sense, about this diversion. It's a question then about, well, are people who are being perfectly productive but not getting a return for their income? And we know that in the States, these medians here have flatlined for a long time, more or less. Gone down a bit there. There's an issue there, and that's to do with social integration, social cohesion, justice, fairness. All those things can be brought into this discussion, and we may wish to do that towards the end. And then there's a question about, well, if you are being more productive, but on the other hand, you're not getting any increasing returns, I'm going to suggest that may be the case, over and above what you see here, what you see there, when we look at detailed income data. There's a question then about how committed people are to the kind of work they're doing. So now I want to move on to problems of productivity. Now, I've just assumed that those lines that you've just seen, those data, reflect some notion of productivity which is unproblematic. But actually, right across the board now, the notion of productivity is problematic. It's problematic because in a global economy, it's not impossible, but it's very difficult to understand where the sources of productivity within a nation actually are when so much of the work is outsourced. And that's a matter in the United States, I understand, of whether you've got sufficient people that can track quickly the sorts of changes in data which are coming in from overseas. And I'm sure that would be the case in the United Kingdom. There are problems in terms of understanding productivity in relation to the net and commerce on the net. There are problems in terms of the service economy. And I want to deal with that here. And in doing so, referring to the work of Antonia Kupfer, who's written a very good feminist critique of human capital theory. And what she says is that what you have is that very often you have low-wage cases, typically women, who may in fact be very skillful at what they do, carers. And I've just got a journal article in for my own journal, which is looking at caring in Denmark and showing the level of skill involved in that process. But it's not reflected in terms of their wages. So they might be very productive, although how you understand productivity in this particular case is difficult. That's for sure. I mean, is this that they make a contribution to society, or are they also being more productive? Employers in the United Kingdom try and make them more productive by reducing the amount of time they spend with each individual they have to care for. Very often they get 15-minute slots, and that's it. So there are issues there, and they are to do with gender in particular, I think. And I think that what human capital theory does is gloss over a mix of assumptions that involve culture and power relations as well as skills. And we may come back to the issue of culture and power in relation to recruitment a little later. Gary Becker found trying to fit women into human capital theory very difficult. And I'll give you an example. Remember that the view of human capital theory that Becker took understood power in terms of market power, so monopolies, oligopolies, power in that sense, but much more difficult in terms of the understanding of power in the sense of gender. Given, although in 1983, when he wrote a paper, he was talking about the issue of gender and why women earned less, and his answer I'll give you in a minute. But at that stage, feminism and feminist theory was moving ahead at a great pace. But he couldn't admit it into the particular theoretical structure that he had. And Becker then answered the question by saying, well, actually, women are not as productive as men at work because they have many different roles in their lives and they cannot fit them all in to the same maximum productive potential in terms of the workplace, the paid workplace. To which my response is, I have a team of 9 women. They are more productive, I think, than I am. Well, who knows? But certainly, yeah. So, now I want to look at the relationship between education and income. As we've said, income is meant to reflect productive potential. And Gary Becker, back in 2006, declared that we were now living in the age of human capital, based on the revolution in technology, which brought skill bias theory to prominence. Now, this might be heretical, but I see skill bias theory as a kind of younger sibling of human capital theory, but one which focuses more on technology. And the assumption was, for a very long time, that as technology was introduced, so the demand for more skilled labour would increase. And I shall come back to that issue because much of my work, including this work, is with Phil Brown. We've been working together for almost 30 years across the globe, now closer in geographical proximity. And we wrote a book in 2011 called The Global Auction, The Broken Promises of Education, Jobs and Income. And in that book, one of the things that we identified was that the technology was skill replacing. Digital Taylorism, as we called it, it wasn't skill biased. And I'll come back to that point. Let's have a look at some of these data then. They may well be common and perfectly well understood all round. But one of the debates in the United Kingdom, and I've seen it reflected here, has been one about, well, if you go to college and you do a 4-year college degree, how much more money are you on average likely to earn than someone who is not? And who the someone who is not can be variable. It can be someone who's quite a good high school graduate or someone who's dropped out. The comparators are very often varied. But when you disaggregate the data, you get this kind of view here. And so we've put this in, and we go up here to 2007. And this is from the Economic Policy Institute in Washington. But what you see there is that period of what you might call the technological revolution, starting in the early 70s and going up to 2007. Once you've disaggregated the data, the people at the top decile do rather well. All these other people flatline. And there's some interesting things here on a minor scale in terms of human capital theory. Look, these are the top high school students, and they're earning more than the college median. And that, we'll see, is repeated in the United Kingdom, and it's repeated in the further data on our analysis of American data. So that's the men. Now, the women. And what you see is there is some gain there. Clearly, these at the top decile, and a little bit of a gain here. But again, the income is lower than that for men. I want to bring you up to date. And there are a number of things about this figure which I think are very important. So this is 2010. Now, along here you have age. And this is panel data, so it's not longitudinal, so it's not as strong as if you were actually following people through from woe to go, from the age of 20 to 29, 30 to 39, 40 to 49, 50 to 64. But what you see is these people in the top decile doing extremely well. And that reflects, there was a very good paper by Claudia Golden and Katz on data from Harvard. Income from Harvard. And the people in economics and finance did extraordinarily well relative to your average graduate in the United States, if I recall correctly. I mean, just amazing. Then what you get here is high school top decile students, again, just outperforming the median graduates, coming together there and then dropping away there. And what you see most importantly, I think, is a flatlining of these data. And if that is really the case, then we can explain it at least in one way. And it is yet shocking for human capital theorists, if this is correct. We can explain it by saying that actually the way companies are now restructured, they have much flatter structures. They don't have the corporate hierarchies where people are moving up the career ladder and gaining income as they go, but rather what they're getting is a bonus at the end of every year, which is not consolidated in their income. And so in other words, the way in which people are being compensated or remunerated is now quite different. That would be an inference to be drawn from these data. Now, what human capital theorists, and particularly Jacob Mintzer, argued was that actually that is much more likely to be the trajectory for all these groups. And the reason for that was that he thought that there would be a greater return on experience in the workplace, and an increasing return on experience, and any other additional education that people undertook while at work. And what we see is that that's not the case. Now that's the men. That's the women. But again, the flatlining. So, quite significant. And then I thought that if you thought that the United States was an exception, I'd show you some of the data from Great Britain. From Britain. I was going to say United Kingdom, and I'm not sure we've got much of that left, depending on what happens in the next year or so, but yeah. So just Britain will do, I guess. And you can see that there's something quite similar going on here in terms of both the returns to the top decile, but also in terms of the flatlining of the rest. And in the UK, we have A-level students, top decile. In other words, these are people that could go to university. They have the qualification to go to university. And what you see there is something very similar in terms of their returns relative to median graduates. So that in itself is interesting, really interesting. Then when we look at the women, surprise, surprise. Here we are, 2015, and how much progress have we made? I'm not sure. Not a lot, when you compare these data. So when you start disaggregating these data, what you see, I think, is that there isn't a kind of premium for having got a 4-year college degree. It depends on, I guess, your life's trajectory, the career structure that you aim for, and then you get these returns. And the only people that really fit the common perception, and particularly amongst policymakers, are those at the top decile. So one way of addressing these issues is to say, well, actually, what we've got here is the reason why so many of those graduates are have low income is because they're in the wrong job. They're in the wrong section of education. They should all be engineers or whatever, you know. So science, maths, engineering, technology is seen as the kind of the great saviour. And I want to suggest that that is not the case. And I want to suggest that's not the case for a number of reasons. So there are several hypotheses here of the relationship of education to the labour market. And the first one I want to point to is the work of Hal Hansen, who wrote a terrific paper in 2011 on credentials. And he basically argued, as I understood it in that paper, that what we have is a system whereby he compared German and American systems. And he said that the German system was much more precise in locating people relative to their educational training and qualification into the labour market than in America, where many more people were encouraged to go into university, 4-year graduate degrees. And the same would apply to the United Kingdom, where we now have around 20, 40, 45, around 45% of every age cohort go to university. So there's a question there about precision. But I don't think that's going to explain what we see now. The next one is that at the same time as we have a degree of job upgrading, those, let us say, at the top decile, what we're seeing beneath that is the stratification of knowledge work. The idea that there's undifferentiated knowledge work is simply incorrect. What we're seeing is much more stratification of knowledge work. And so you have the people at the top with permission to think, and they get the money. And then you have people that will execute their thinking. And then beneath them, you have, and I'll come on to this in greater detail, are those that do routinized digital work. And so it's not surprising to see those kinds of profiles of income in relation to graduate work that I was showing you a little earlier. And I think that may now be true for many professions, whereby those at the top do really well, but then there are barefoot doctors or barefoot teachers or whatever it happens to be, that there's a stratification within professions, which could reflect this kind of thing. Then I think there's simply what we might call job competition, and this we see a lot of. So, for example, in the United States, from the data I've seen, and certainly for the United Kingdom, repeatedly now, new studies coming out, which show that around 50% of graduates do non-graduate work, subgraduate work. And if that is the case, and it's clearly the case in the United Kingdom, then what we've got is a process of bumping down. So what happens is the graduates then do the non-graduate work, and then those beneath them get shoved down to doing other work, but I'll qualify that in a minute. And then those at the very bottom, the least skilled, least educated, get knocked out of the labour market or do very insecure kind of work, although many, many graduates are now doing work which is highly insecure. Bartending. Interesting question as to why employers would prefer graduates for that kind of work than those who are less well educated. And I have a theory about that. It's a form of signalling, which is another form of human capital theory, but of a particular sort, which I'm happy to talk about. The other point is that graduates are clearly being offshored, and that was the essence of my book with Phil Brown on the global auction. Quick story. Have we got time? Yeah. Quick story. Goes like this. The first interview we did with a multinational company was in Munich. And we go into the office of the executive director of human resources there. And I'm coming from a human capitalist background, right? And I say, do you have a shortage of engineers? And I was expecting him to say, yes. And he goes, no. I said, now watch, this is 2005, so watch my mindset here. 2005, I go, okay, so do you get them from Germany? He says, no. I go, okay, do you get them from Britain? He goes, no. I said, do you get them from America? He goes, no. I'm getting exasperated by them. So I go, where do you get them from? And he says, China, India, Russia for mathematicians and IT, and particularly Bulgaria for IT, because in the Soviet Empire, Bulgaria was located as the place for IT. And all of a sudden, Phil Brown and my eyes on world just opened up. This guy was seeing a global labour market. He wasn't seeing a national labour market, and an interest in a national labour market. And what you then see is that when you start looking at the data, is that you can get all these graduates in these countries 3 years ago at about a tenth of the price of a graduate from the United States or Britain. So we are assuming, very difficult to establish, but we are assuming that a lot of these jobs have effectively been offshored. We're assuming it, we don't know it. It's incredibly difficult. You'd have to go into many multinational companies, executive corporate offices, and sit in and listen to where they talk about how they're going to allocate their labour across the globe. But that's what we assume. And then finally, there's the de-skilling, the job de-skilling and loss due to technology. And Richard has talked about this in Dancing with Robots, which is absolutely a wonderful title and a very fine piece of work. But it is that. What time are we ending, Helen?
It's okay, you carry on. Don't worry.
Am I okay? Okay.
Yes, you can.
So this then brings me on to digital Taylorism. Hang on, come back. Phil Brown coined the phrase digital Taylorism to identify what seemed to be happening in terms of IT across the globe. And how we got to this was in this way. We'd heard these executives talking about the use of technology, and it was clear that they were using it as a way of substituting for labour. And then at the same time, and sometimes with research there's a bit of serendipity, right? I mean, it really does help. My son, I had a small Peugeot, and my son was growing very tall, and he couldn't fit in the back of the Peugeot comfortably. So I phone my bank manager and I say, hi, look, I need £5,000 to buy a new second-hand car because my son's getting too large. And he goes, hi, good to talk to you, Hugh. Yeah, no problem, only I can't make that decision anymore. And something just clicked. No clue what, sometimes just intuition. Something clicked. And I said, can I come down and interview you? And can I record the interview? And he said, yeah, no worries. So I go down to the bank, and he says, okay, I'm going to show you. Here are your files. And that's a bit like going to the dentist, because what do banks think about your credit worthiness, that kind of thing. A bit of a worry. So, and he takes me through. He says, okay, here's your application. I had to write our application. So here's your application. They ask all the usual kinds of questions. How much do you spend a month? How much do you have coming in? Can you afford the loan? All that kind of stuff. And at the end of it, I said, well, what happens? And he'd been talking about this financial control. I said, What happens if the financial controller says that they're going to reject this application? Can you go and argue with him or her? And he looked at me, and throughout this research, this look became common in many different countries. He looked at me a little sadly, and he said, you've got to understand that the financial controller is an algorithm. It is not a human being. This is a man who was a graduate. He was 40 years old. He'd built up a big business in the Bath area, and he'd been replaced by an algorithm. I said, what do you do now? He said, I sell products. And not only do I sell products, and so this is, advice on death duties or insurance, whatever it happens to be. He said, but I have a script for every one that I sell. He said, I don't keep to it. And he said, a junior with a ready smile could now do my job. And the next time I went into the bank, there was a guy of about 10 with spiky hair, and he says, Professor Lauder, really pleased to see you. I've got this great product. I think you're going to love it. And I'm going, oh no, thank you very much. because of course what happened was that the man I'd interviewed had left. He couldn't take it. That is digital Taylorism, where you get people who are highly skilled and you replace them with technology. That's just an example. And that clearly is something that's moving up the skill chain very, very rapidly indeed. And of course, then those routinized knowledge workers may well have degrees, but they're not going to get much money because actually the judgments they make are highly circumscribed and limited. And when they can't make a judgment, when you phone up and ask a question about a bill or whatever it is, they'll shift you on to the next person up, who also has a script, and then to the next person who has a script. And there's a pyramid then of these people until you get to the top, if you ever get there. If you've got enough money on your phone to be able to hold on for long enough. It took me an hour and a half to get through to the tax department in England to stop them from charging me the equivalent of about $1,800 for which I wasn't, they just shouldn't have done it. And I get on the phone and the guy goes, yeah, that's fine, no worries. I'll put something in the post to you. Hour and a half wait. And it cost me. The cost of education, well, you know these data probably better than I do. You experience this, I'm sure, as much as I do. I have a daughter who's doing a master's now in script writing, and the fees are just astronomical. And then there's the living expenses on top. So costs. And these data here you will be aware of. But I really like this quote here from William Bennett, a former Secretary of Education. Students might be better off investing their tuition money in stocks and bonds rather than a degree from one of our nation's many colleges. Well, I don't think you'd want to be playing the stock market either right now. Indeed, not since 2008. Well, between 2008 and now, you probably would have been lucky, I'm not sure. But you probably wouldn't want to do it. And I think the point is there, it's just that the degree of risk and uncertainty now in terms of investment in education is a major issue. Then human capital. What is human capital? What do we know now? Well, when those human capital theorists of the 50s and 60s, those neoclassical human capital theorists, were working, they assumed a system, and this is why I think that we need to see human capital theory, as with all theories, they have a birth, they live, and they die. And for us, that business of living and dying depends on the social context in which they operate. And in this case, what you had, of course, was the rise of large corporations, 50s and 60s, across the United Kingdom, United States. And people could get a degree and then move into the bottom rungs of those corporate ladders. And that was relatively unproblematic for many. Now that is much more problematic. And I'll just say something first of all about what students have to do. Students now not only have to get a degree, but they have to also be able to demonstrate a whole range of proxies for skills through their CVs, their extracurricular activities. Have you gone and worked in, I don't know, the Sudan? with kids who are in poverty, people who are in poverty? Have you climbed Mount Everest and done it in a certain period of time and taken 40 other people with you on your team? Have you taken a submarine underneath the South, the Antarctic, whatever it happens to be? I mean, you make it up. And there's a wonderful book by Laura Rivera called Pedigree, which unpacks for Phil Brown and myself. We've noticed and written about two things here. One is that recruitment to the elite positions are always focused, apart from Germany and New Zealand, on 3 or 4 of the top universities in every country. Germany, New Zealand, because they have much more egalitarian university systems, much harder to pick out which the elite are. So what you get then, and they all talk about this pool that they fish in, and it's a small pool, which is an interesting phenomenon in itself. But it's a small pool of elite universities that they fish in, these large multinationals, for those that they see as talented. And so now what you have is a stratification of those who are talented, and then the rest, as it were. As the first major disjuncture. So the talented are those in the top deciles that you saw earlier. And what Laura Rivera does is, I don't know how she did this, but she got into banks, got into accountancy firms, got into law firms here in the States, and followed through the recruitment processes. And I mention this because what's very clear from our work and the work that she does in detail is that what these multinational companies are interested in is talent. And talent is a proxy for a certain kind of character. It is not to do with specific skills. You might be able to decompose them into particular skills, but what Laura Rivera shows is that that's not what these companies are doing. They're just not doing that. And we don't think that multinationals are doing it either, in that particular kind of way. So, on the one hand, you've got a holistic view. And, the interesting thing is that when you get your degrees, there will be some rubric from the Chancellor or the Provost or whomsoever President, and it'll be something which says, the rights, duties, and entitlements of becoming a degree holder. And this is to do with some holistic concept of you as a person, as a character. It's not about the particular... Then you're not getting this because you've got a particular skill. So that's on the one hand. And on the other hand, you have people like the OECD, PIAC, Leon Grusky, sociologist over in California, Richard here, I think, who are looking to try and decompose the bits of the parts of what it is that we have in education into skills. And then looking at the relationship between those skills and people's income. And so at best, there's a kind of at odds thing going on here between some holistic judgments that are being made and then the more academic work, which is looking at the decomposition of skills. And further investigation might tell us that actually you can put the two together. I would be surprised. Because so much of the judgment that's being made in recruitment is about where you've come from. If you go to one of the top Chinese universities, if you go to one of the top British universities, what you're expecting is a particular kind of person. And Randall Collins's work on culture and recruitment, I think, comes in here. And it's class culture. And it could be gender culture, it could be ethnic cultures. But there are at-odds issues going on here that we need to sort out. That's as much as I want to say right now about it, except for students. It must be hell. And I never had to do anything like that. I could say, played rugby, played cricket, captain of that, and that would be kind of at the very bottom of the CV, and that would be it. But Laura Rivera is very good on CVs and how they're read. So The Economist glossed this book as one that every student or every graduate should read if they want a good job. That's The Economist. That's what you'd expect from them. For us, it's a question of social justice. It's a curious question about economic efficiency as well. Very difficult to sort out. So, what about education? Well, I want to say this before I stop. If what I'm saying is roughly correct, there's a huge problem about the relationship of education to the economy, and there is a huge problem with social mobility, because what you might have hoped for is that that part of the assumptions of human capital theory, that people are chosen on merit, would hold up. Now, it may be that those that get these elite jobs can do the elite jobs. They certainly will have a lot of performance goals, and they will work their guts out for them, there's no question. But that's not the issue. The issue is how many other people could also do those jobs. Why did those people get those jobs? And I think that's a very important issue that we need to think about. But what I really want to say is this, that we've got a situation now where the numbers of jobs increasing at the top end are small. And Dick's got data in his Dancing with Robots which shows that the high-skilled jobs leveled out at around 2,000. And they flatline after that, the two sets of. So we're not seeing any kind of room at the top. And that raises, real issues about social justice, who wins. And what policymakers' response to this is, you need more education. We need more performance from you. You need more education. And what they're doing is cramming more and more people into this narrowing funnel of positional competition. And the question is that a reasonable way of going about things? Is it worth the costs to families, to individual students, when the chances are increasingly less being the case? That's the question, I think, that we need to really consider. And when you look at the work of Bob and Dick, what you see is you get solutions. So pathways to prosperity. Bob makes the point quite rightly that if we focus on those intermediate jobs, you might call those the vocationally skilled jobs, and he did a great job coming to the UK, may I say that? Because the one thing that our education system has totally ignored is more or less your community colleges, our FE colleges. And that's a class issue. It's simply because that's where working class people go. And they just ignore them. I mean, the policymakers just ignore it. And they're squeezing them even now. So Bob's intervention was actually very, very helpful in that particular way. And Dick's talked about the kinds of skills needed in order to gain those important jobs. And I think, I shall now be very provocative, but I think that what I want to say is that the situation we're now in, those things are important. They're not to be denied. But many people may gain those sorts of skills, high-level skills, and will not get high-level jobs. And there's a real question now about whether we need to rethink the relationship between education and the labour market. Fundamentally rethink it. And my two penneth worth is this. I think that we need to be radical in the sense of focusing beyond education. Education can't do it on its own. We need to think about the notion of a basic income so that people can have the confidence to know that they may experiment with technology, they may experiment in different ways, but that they will still be able to survive in a society. That we may want things from them. Part of basic income might be to do with carers, because that's very important. And there's a book coming out very soon, I saw reviewed last Sunday here, on the issue of gender, work and caring. That looked to me like a book that I should read. So what I'm trying to do is throw open some possibilities for change. Doesn't mean we'll get them, because the pathways that we're locked into are really solid. I mean, they're very difficult to remove. One thing I know is that perpetual testing, and I think many of us would agree with that, constant testing. I once asked a senior policymaker who had done a review of primary schooling in England, and I said, how do you know that if you test kids, that what they've learnt they will retain? And he looked at me like I was from Mars. But actually, I think it's a question worth asking. I taught in a school in inner London, which was a down-and-out school, and the kids came in with better literacy and numeracy than they left with. So the testing didn't do the job. So on that slightly downbeat note, I think I will now retire. Thank you very much for listening.
We now ask Dick to comment, respond, elaborate, whatever. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Hugh, for provocative talk. So I want to begin by thanking you for sending me his PowerPoint and 2 papers a few days ago. It gave me the opportunity to read some of his recent work and to at least predict what he was going to say. So let me just say at the beginning, though, I think there are different roles about you and I agree on many things, don't agree on some others. But just to be clear about what the argument Adam Smith brought to economics in a book that's easy to Americans to date, 1776, Wealth of Nations, is that even when when markets work very well, they often don't. When they work very well, they produce an efficient allocation of resources. It has a particularly precise definition to economists. There is no argument in economics that efficiently operating markets produce a distribution of income any country or any group of individuals would find at all ethically satisfactory. So when you think about roles for a government in any society, there are roles dealing with making allocation of resources efficient. Talk about that. But there's also roles, even if you thought markets were working well, you'd want to intervene because clearly everybody has views on what they consider an acceptable distribution of resources, what's an acceptable safety net. We probably wouldn't agree, but we'd all have views. And economists have nothing to say about that. So, I would agree with a central point in Hugh's talk. Institutions matter. So there's no question that governments need to play important roles in a great many aspects of the economy, both to promote economic growth, make the economic pie as large as possible that we have to divide it among us, and to influence how the fruits of this economic growth are divided up. I think everyone would agree with that probably. Now, some of these roles, including providing opportunities for every citizen to obtain high-quality education and training suited to their interests and society's needs, framing the rules within which labor markets operate, including guaranteeing rights of workers to bargain collectively and the provision of a livable minimum wage, and formulating and enforcing regulations and tax codes that induce businesses to behave in a way that stimulates economic growth, encourages them to provide good jobs, and requires them to pay a fair share of taxes so as to promote social goals like a strong social safety net and excellent infrastructure. So I think we would definitely agree, you and I, on those things. Now, where we don't agree, I'm not comfortable the way Hugh has characterized human capital theory. Now, in that regard, Hugh's characterization of human capital theory is held by some economists, especially those in what economists sometimes call our freshwater economics departments, meaning those not located on the coast, such as the University of Chicago, where the idea was originally formulated by these eminent economists, 2 of whom won Nobel Prizes. Now, Hugh accurately characterizes this description of the human capital as one in which, and I quote from Hugh's work, human capital can only be captured in returns to individual and nations where flexible and free, where markets are flexible and free from state intervention. Now, that's a very polar characterization of human capital theory, I would argue. It's not a caricature. I mean, it's fair. This characterization of capitalist theory led University of Chicago, the bastion of freshwater economics, to counsel the Pinochet regime in Chile in the late 1970s, introduce educational vouchers so that families could choose, supposedly, whether they would go to school, either public or private schools. Now, I think this polar characterization of capital theory, while is embraced by relatively few economists today, especially in saltwater economics departments like Harvard, MIT, Princeton, and Berkeley. One reason is that several decades of research have shown that conditions under which freely operating markets produce efficiency do not hold in most sectors, including education. One of several sources of market failure, that if you don't get even an efficient allocation of resources if you let markets operate freely, in education, is that peer groups and networks matter. What economists call externalities. And one of the things you learn in microeconomic theory is in the presence of externalities, markets don't produce an efficient allocation of resources. Now this helps explain why the dominant consequences of 25 years of educational vouchers in Chile has been increasing isolation of low-income children in some schools and high-income children in different schools. Surely not a desirable outcome. This example also illustrates why most economists, especially those at saltwater institutions, recognize there's no such thing as free markets. I mean, that's a term you hear politicians talking about, but when economists who are thoughtful about this realize that just doesn't make any sense. All markets operate within the context of laws and regulations. So the important questions are not free markets versus unfree markets. The important questions are the consequences of changing the details of laws and regulations. So it's a much more fine-grained consideration that I think really has to inform public policy. Now, the majority of economists, especially those at saltwater universities, see human capital theory in much broader terms than the way you has described it, I believe. Most labor economists and educational economists see human capital theory as a framework for examining the potential benefits of education, including benefits that are not related to wages and employment, and also costs, the reason why some individuals do not make educational investments even though they seem to be in their interest. On the benefits side, some of the important, relatively new causal findings from research motivated by human capital theory has been that education increases health and length of life, and that young women's enrollment in college improves the health of their children that they subsequently bear. Quite powerful, interesting work. Now on the cost side, one of the most interesting papers motivated by human capital theory shows the complexity of completing federal financial aid form, the so-called FAFSA, that discourages students from low-income families from applying to college. This research, with its implications on the importance of simplifying financial aid application processes, was conducted by HGSE faculty member Bridget Long and her colleagues. Now, turning to, in one of his papers, Hugh and his colleagues wrote, human capital theorists assume that the nature and quality of education can be accurately reflected in international test scores, such as PISA and TIMSS. In my view, that's by no means a common assumption among economists who find human capital theory valuable. Indeed, in recent decades, now in fairness, there are two economists that he cited who really do embrace that, that's for sure. But two economists do not a profession make. In recent decades, there's been a lot of research by economists based on human capital theory that has examined how computer-based technical change and globalization of trade have affected the demand for different kinds of skills. One of the most interesting recent papers on this topic was written by HGSE economist David Deming, who documents the increasing importance of social skills. Now, Hugh didn't seem to be comfortable with this, and he is right that I am one of these folks who spends a lot of time thinking about, well, what kind of skills are really important? And I agree, we all like to have talent. But let's think about educators. If their job is defined as produce talented students, they may ask, well, what curriculum do I use? What pedagogy should I use? What should I pay most attention to? Well, I think those are important questions to answer. And you've got to think about, well, what kinds of skills really matter. And I think David's work on the importance of these social skills is extremely critical, because it really shows the kind of drill and kill technology that's used particularly in high priority schools to prepare kids to take MCAS and exams does not serve them well. So I think this kind of unpacking of what we mean by skills really is important, particularly because those are the questions educators need answers to. So in conclusion, most economists who worry about labor market education today do think institutions are very important. In fact, many of them study the consequences of changes in institutions. For example, lots of work on the kind of 500-pound gorilla from way to the labor markets is technical change and globalization. Well, the consequences of those have varied somewhat among countries in terms of how they've affected wage distribution because of differences in institutions across countries. So that's kind of the lead into Bob. But so what I would encourage you, for those who are interested in economics, the labor markets, and or education, go to a place in which the economists have this broad definition of human capital theory rather than the narrow one that you described.
Thank you very much. Floor's yours.
Thanks, Helen, and thanks you. As you may have guessed from Helen's introduction, I'm not an economist, and my comments will pretty quickly get to what do we do with what Hugh has described. Just a couple of words by way of background. Hugh alluded to a report that I and two colleagues here released in 2011 called Pathways to Prosperity. We basically, our jumping off point was, we were looking at two sources of data, at least initially, really three. But the first was the question we were asking is, why is it that given all of the attention in the U.S. to the four-year degree as the only legitimate, socially acceptable outcome of a high school education, why is it that we basically have been stuck? We're now making some progress, but at the time we started to look at this in 2008, there had been very little progress over the previous 15 or 20 years in raising the proportion of young people who by their mid-20s actually have a four-year degree. In the U.S., it wasn't that we hadn't sold young people and their parents on the notion that this was really the preferred, desired outcome of a high school education. When you survey high school seniors today and you ask, what are you going to do after high school, 90% say they're going on to college. When you look at enrollment in higher education institutions in October following high school graduation, now roughly somewhere between 2/3 and 70% of young people are in some form of post-secondary education. But when you ask the hard question, by age 25, what proportion of young Americans have a four-year degree, it's edging up there. It's getting close to 1 in 3. But you ask yourself, 1 in 3 young Americans with a four-year degree. What proportion of kids actually then have some other credential that has value in the labor market? Well, it's another 10% roughly have a 2-year degree, and another maybe 12% have a 1-year post-secondary certificate that has some value in the labor market. It gets you a little over 50%, which does raise this very interesting question, which is, what is our strategy for the other half of young people who don't have a four-year degree? So that was question one we raised. The second question we raised really had to do with the predictions about the labor market and what was really happening here. Economists have been telling us for the previous 20 years that we were moving into an economy in which there really were only going to be two kinds of jobs at the end of the day. High-wage, high-skilled jobs that required at least a four-year degree, and low-wage, low-skilled jobs for everybody else. Well, I now think the data is pretty clear that, in fact, while yes, it's true that 2/3 of the jobs projected are going to require some kind of post-secondary education, but roughly, a third of jobs, 30%, economists can argue back and forth, but roughly, somewhere around 30% of jobs are going to be in this so-called middle skills category that Hugh alluded to. Jobs that clearly require a solid foundation of knowledge and skills, especially the best of these jobs, a strong kind of underpinning of mathematics and science, but requiring, and certainly some education beyond high school, but not necessarily a 4-year degree. And so the question we raised was kind of, okay, what's our strategy for trying to figure out how do we connect this large chunk of young people who clearly are struggling in the labor market with access to these middle skill jobs, which you can see particularly in fields like IT and healthcare. These are technician level jobs, a lot of which pay a perfectly good wage. The Brookings Institution did a study a couple of years ago pointing out that roughly half of the jobs in the so-called STEM fields are in this sort of middle skill category, technician jobs, average wage $53,000. You see them across a broad range of occupations. And when employers talk about the skills gap, and employers and economists tend to kind of argue back and forth about whether the skills gap here is real or imagined. But the reality is, at least from the perspective of employers, there continues to be this very substantial problem. That's all right. It's probably Nancy calling.
All right.
I was going to quote. So here we are in an economy that now is getting pretty close to these traditional definitions of full employment. In July, 5.8 million job postings. That is jobs looking for people. 17 million Americans either unemployed or working only part-time, aspiring to full-time work. And come back to our report for a second. The third source of data that we looked at, and again, Hugh kind of alluded to this, was to say, are we really an outlier here internationally? How do other countries organize themselves to make sure that a much larger fraction of their young people make a successful transition from the end of compulsory schooling into the labor market? And if you look particularly in Northern Europe, Hugh alluded to Germany, but it's a whole set of countries. Our favorite country happens to be Switzerland, which has a lot of the same features as the German system, but for a variety of reasons I think has more to teach the U.S. I'll say a word about that. But the point is, the reality is, yes, the U.S. is an outlier in not having developed any kind of formal system other than our higher education system to enable most young people to make a successful transition from the end of schooling to work. So you do have this kind of big mismatch problem. There's a great book that two Harvard economists that Dick knows well, Larry Katz and Claudia Golden, did a few years ago called The Race Between Education and Technology. Essentially, their argument was, this gets to this question of, at the broad strokes level, what is the relationship between education and the economy? They argue that at least through the first 7 decades of the 20th century, that when educational attainment kept continually rising, first high school completion became virtually universal. Then after the Second World War, huge explosion of access to higher education, mass higher education, GI Bill, and that as more and more Americans got education, in fact, the economy kind of took advantage of that, and so these two things could rise together. As Hugh points out, at a certain point, though, you do have this divergence between productivity increasing but wages flattening. And this is obviously a problem that we are, now has become kind of front and center among U.S. Policymakers. One of the problems I have often with the kind of data that we see from our economist friends is again today in the New York Times is a quite good piece, but the comparison that people often want to make is between those with a high school degree only, high school diploma only, and those with a college degree. And if you look just at those two numbers, or those, what you see is this huge widening gap. And the obvious inference from that is, you better get yourself a college degree. Well, the reality is that the bottom has totally fallen out of the economy for young people with only a high school diploma. Those with 4-year degrees, actually, they have been, actually slightly losing ground, but nowhere near as rapidly as those with only a high school diploma. in the 4 years now since our report was written, there's been a lot of kind of data that have come along to actually confirm the kind of argument that we're making, the question that we're raising about whether or not it makes sense to continue to behave as if everybody's going to go off to a 4-year college and live happily ever after. Hugh alluded to one important source of data, which we now have pretty clear evidence. Federal Reserve Bank of New York 2 years ago did a study. 44% of 4-year degree holders under 25 were in fact working in jobs that didn't traditionally require a 4-year degree. One of the things that's clearly going on here is that employers, this comes back to your point about signaling, employers are using, in a labor market in which there are more job seekers than jobs, one of the easiest ways to kind of sort through a pile of applications is simply to say, let's just look at those with a 4-year degree. Burning Glass, which is a very interesting kind of data analytics, real-time labor market outfit here in Boston, put out a report pretty recently called Moving the Goalposts. And one of the things they did was to look at the discrepancy between the education requirements in job postings versus the actual educational levels of people holding those jobs currently. And what you see is that some pretty huge discrepancies. Just one obvious example. Currently, 19% of people, mostly women, who are executive assistants or executive secretaries, 19% have 4-year degrees, but 65% of the job postings require a 4-year degree. You could argue, well, maybe there has been some upskilling, some requirements, but that seems kind of doubtful. And you can see the same kind of credential inflation taking place across a much broader range of jobs. So here's one of the dilemmas for me, at least in terms of the work that I currently do. By the way, great. We're interested in this set of issues around what's happening in the labor market, implications for education, training. There's a center at Georgetown University called the Center on Education and the Workforce, headed by an economist named Tony Carnevale, labor economist, and they've put out a really, I think, impressive set of reports over the last several years, and they crank them out on a pretty regular basis. And just pretty recently, they put out a report looking at what's happened now that the economy has started to bounce back. And they basically said, look, there's been something like 6 million new jobs since the recovery has created. They kind of broke those jobs into good jobs and not so good jobs, argued that there are about 2.9 million jobs that met their criteria for good jobs, that is paying a wage of $50,000 or better and having strong benefits associated with them. And when you ask who's getting those jobs, well, only 100,000 of that 2.9 million jobs are going to people without a 4-year degree. So again, you've got, the question is, again, I think Hugh alluded to this problem before, which is people taking jobs that traditionally didn't require a 4-year degree and then sort of pushing down the people who traditionally might have filled those jobs and who are continuing to struggle in the labor market. So we've got this problem. We've got this growing chunk of middle skill jobs out there, technician level jobs. Mostly, a lot of them kind of going begging. We don't have a strategy to actually connect our education and training system to create pipelines to those jobs. We're continuing to lose 1 out of 5 young people before they even graduate from high school. We continue to have an education system which, in my view at least, has this kind of lost the balance between the narrowly academic purposes of education and the career preparation and civic purposes of education. And consequently, we have lots and lots of young people struggling. If you put in a quick commercial for an Asquith forum that I'm moderating coming up on October 19th, which is focused on the Swiss vocational system. One of the people joining me in this panel is the woman who ran the federal office that presides over that system for about a dozen years. And that system gives you a sense of what would an education system look like that actually was much more closely linked to the economy, that provided opportunities for most young people to actually move into programs that combine learning in a workplace and learning in an academic setting that had a very strong kind of youth development focus, and at the end of the day managed to not only produce a better alignment between what the economy needed and what kind of skills young people come out with, but also created a kind of a dynamic system in which what young people come out with at 19 or 20 or 21 is really just a kind of starting point. It's a system that actually prepares 70% of young people move through the vocational system rather than the sort of the more traditional academic universities. There's a whole other set of universities built on that are applied universities that provide opportunities for young people to continue to get an education all the way through to a master's degree after their initial apprenticeship or vocational program. And it really is a system that, as I say, I think both effectively serves the needs of young people and effectively serves the needs of the economy. Why does it work? It works because employers there band together in their own sectors of the economy and really act in their own enlightened self-interest, I would argue. That is, they understand that catching young people and engaging them, providing opportunities for them to develop a kind of strong work ethic and work experience and doing it in a way that really provides a ton of coaching and support to them, rather than leaving it to kids to find their own way after they leave schooling, serves their own kind of economic needs and, more importantly, serves the developmental needs of young people. Let me stop there and then let's open this up for
Thank you very much
questions.
for that. Thank you very much for this. We're now to question and answers. I sort of have a very big, slightly frivolous comment. Well, I mean, obviously, we should either set up companies to run gap year programs to climb Mount Everest in large numbers. We should all decamp to Switzerland. But let's start off. Could you like to come sort of move forward to the people's teams and come to the front, perhaps? And then the chairs. And I look forward to provocative questions from the floor. So, who'd like to start? Yes.
I found this rather fascinating since I spend a certain segment of my time as a STEM education advocate for very poorly served kids right here in the blessed state of Massachusetts. What I find is, maybe you can comment on this, I've talked to people in manufacturing and other places say that a lot of jobs that are going begging where people, if they had some STEM training, they would only need a 2-year degree. They wouldn't need 4-year, and that would be more than satisfactory for the businesses. I'm encouraging some kids to pursue possibly applying to Germany, to leaving their own country, because they have free tuition. And even though there are increasing number of Americans who are applying, it's not caught on. But I say, you need to go where you have the skills, and if your socioeconomic status will preclude you, you need to go where people will support you and value it. If it's not your own country, go somewhere else. I had the great pleasure, I'm an MIT and Harvard alum, I had the delightful pleasure of being a judge, a mentor and a judge this past weekend for Hack MIT, which has a completely random lottery. So it wasn't like Stanford, MIT, Harvard, the usual suspects. I talked to amazing ideas from kids from state schools. It was any undergraduate from any college. I got to see remarkable talent. And I'm strongly, as a part of economic development, as a former employee of a company, I'm encouraging kids to think about, if they get a job, doing some kind of startup. Do not count on the economy to care or give a damn about you. Find some skill or develop some reasonable marketable skill and sell it on the market so that you will be compensated. I personally, as a black woman in technology, left technology because, like they said, I was considered uppity because I had the audacity to ask for the compensation that I rightfully deserved. I've been on my own for over 20 years. I have a marketable skill. I don't have to put up with this. I'm trying to encourage the students to also find a way where their value will be in the market. One last thing. What is it? Not Georgetown? Not Georgia. No, Georgia Tech has a MOOC online program. The dean came to speak, where you can get an online master's degree, like a certified master's in computer science for 1/4 of the tuition that it would cost for if they were. So they have an amazing, amazing demographic of students who are coming.
Thank you for those very useful comments. Thank you. I think that was a sort of statement rather than question, so let's take that as an addition to the commentary. Who would like to make the next point? Jane.
So I'm sort of interested in the broad versus narrow distinction in human capital that you guys are talking about, and I sort of just wondered, Dave, if you could maybe describe a little bit more what the sort of broader definition of human capital is, because I mean, in some ways, though particular pieces of that broader definition might still hold true, wouldn't it still be quite a loss if the very classical definition of sort of education as a way to earn money, as a way to earn income, sort of was actually following that story that Hugh was giving us? Because I was hearing you say things like, getting more education might lead to a longer life, a more fulfilling life, but I don't know those things necessarily translate into income necessarily. So it seems in some ways they could even just be considered more just sort of instrumental or positive outcomes of education that aren't necessarily capital in a way.
Okay, who'd like to address this?
Well, let me go briefly. And then
Sure,
you.
yeah.
So, I think if the best source, by the way, of information on the kind of classical, the neoclassical view of capital, but I think it's a terrific piece. It's by David Otter. It's in Science Magazine, 2014. If you go to his website, there's a link right there to it. And there you see these graphs relating education to earnings. Now, there's no question that education is by no means a safe investment. And you has pointed out there's enormous risk in what you major in, where you go, all those things matter. But nonetheless, if you're thinking about if you have a high school student you care about, you know they got to do something beyond high school. I agree with Bob. There's a much broader set of things to do than simply to get a 4-year college degree that you don't know what it's really in. So I think, but that you're going to need something. The reason, by the way, we don't, the way the census and American Community Survey collects information on educational attainments, that you don't know very well what kind of credential you have that's more than a high school diploma and less than a 4-year degree. And I think there's now some newer work on this that does support what Bob has said. I'm not sure I'm answering your question, but let you comment and then you can go from there.
I think your opening was really interesting, and I'd like Dick to say a bit more about it, which is that if you've got this kernel of the freshwater view, then if you then move right away from that, what are you left with? Which is basically a question as I understood it. And I think that's... And the reason I say that is because I think that the analysis and the way of thinking about what's happening comes back to that business of funneling more and more people into this kind of positional competition, where what we've got is it's not a lack of skills, it's a jobs competition, because we've actually got a surfeit of skills in many ways. Not everyone, that's very clear from Dick's work with Greg. I mean, but nevertheless, if you look at it globally, there's a surfeit of these skills. So it's a jobs competition that we're about, and that is a huge problem, as far as I can see.
But you in one of the papers that you sent, you commented that having a labor force in which people are able to respond to new kinds of challenges is important. Of
Oh,
course,
absolutely.
and that idea goes
Yeah.
back to the granddaddy of human capital theory, as
Yes.
you know, T. Paul Schultz.
Yeah.
And I think that, so I think you need to think about what kind of education. And, you know, one of the things is that a lot of politicians who have an agenda, often supported by big dollars from some commercial interests, that they provide what they think of as their interpretation of the evidence to support what they want as policies. And they want as policies, no interference in businesses, not ending the huge tax loophole for carried interest for hedge fund managers. But all that is just politics. I mean, and the influence of the very wealthy. They invoke economics, but not at all in a way that's justified.
I just wanted to come back and comment on something Dick said earlier, because I mean, for me, the headline, in a sense, from Hugh's basic argument, is one of the headlines, is that we're in a world in which attainment by itself doesn't tell you very much. That is, it's no longer a question simply of how much education did you have, but what are the skills that you've come out with, and how well do those skills match with where the economy is going. We now have a lot of data showing very significant overlaps. While it's true that, as a generalization, at the aggregate, the more education you have, we've all seen these bar graphs showing, with each level of education, your lifetime earnings go up. But at the sort of practical human level, what we now see is that significant overlaps where people with licenses and certificates are out earning people with 2-year degrees, where a third of people at least with 2-year degrees are out earning the average 4-year degree holder. And all of this it really, for me at least, again, challenges the notion that simply more is automatically better. I also think that, and this gets to the Obama administration's recent foray into trying to measure productivity of higher education institutions on the basis of earnings, I think it's just worth reminding ourselves that there are purposes of education beyond simply preparing people for the workforce. But that said, I mean, given the rising costs of education, the no longer certain guarantee of a return on that investment, and that almost total failure, at least in the U.S., to provide any kind of structured way to help young people I'd argue, from the kind of middle school years on, to really understand the intersection between their own interests and strengths, the range of possible occupations and careers out there that might be open to them, that might align with their interests and strengths, and the education and training pathways that can lead them to those occupations. So consequently, we have, there's a book called Academically Adrift by 2 sociologists. If you don't know it, in some ways it's the best indictment, if you will, of the price that we pay for not enabling young people to make more informed choices. So basically, the argument is, kids simply drift into college, particularly middle-class kids, because there's no other socially legitimate place for them to go in the society. You're a failure if you don't go off to college. So lots of kids drift into college without any real purpose. College itself becomes the destination. Surprise, surprise, they don't learn very much. And if they haven't chosen a major with at least one eye on with the labor market, they wind up in this huge growing population of kids who leave with debt, but with earnings opportunities that are not even likely to enable them to kind of keep up with their debt payments. So you've got, this is, at least again, an argument I said before, I thought we needed to get a better balance between the career purposes of education and the academic purposes. This is in part what I was alluding to.
I'll just come back very, very quickly, which is that even if you get the right set of skills, and that was my point about flatlining on your graph of these top skills that you were talking about, there are only so many jobs that those people with those skills can fill, unless you have some notion of exponential growth, because the market will bear it and people will create their own work.
I don't agree with that, but
Okay.
we should have other
Well,
questions.
we can come back.
Somebody else had a hand up to
Well, it's going to build directly on that, because it seems like there are sort of two problems. One of which is that credentials have become a really poor signal of skill. So that creates a whole set of problems, because people might have a college credential, but it's not necessarily a proxy that they actually have skills that the market is interested in. And then there's a second problem that even if you do have skills of some kind, there maybe there isn't enough work that rewards skills, or there's some broken link, which is potentially to do with the fact that where the demand for work is in the public sector, which can't necessarily afford to remunerate work in the same way. So I'm just wondering if that characterizes the two problems, or if there's a whole other problem that I'm...
Well, I'll answer very quickly. The point about the public sector is a very interesting one, because when you look at the UK, there's been much talk about, the knowledge economy and the demand for all these graduates and so on and so forth. But actually, the majority of graduates in the UK go into the public sector. The demand is not in the private sector. There is some demand in the private sector for very specific sets of skills, but the majority of the demand is in the public sector. So that in itself tells us a little bit more about the nature of the economy that we're working with. All I can tell you is that I've done a lot of interviews now with very senior employers, and their fundamental concern is to drive costs down, and that means wages and income down. That is. I was only talking to one such person on the train from New York to Boston last night, and I was saying, well, this is what I'm going to talk about. What do you think? And she said, dead right. What she was most focused on was substituting labour with machines.
Can I just have
Quick
one follow-up
comment,
comment?
just because it's very linked to that. So why then, and obviously there's many reasons why this would be the case, but why then are bankers, consultants, top lawyers, engineers still paid? Why is there such a differential still if there's more than enough people with skills at that level?
No, it's not. There are two questions there. One is about the differential, correct? And that you have to look at the sociology of elites. But the other question, and it relates to it, is who's getting those jobs? And that we're very clear about. We know what's going on. And that's evidence from this country, evidence from Great Britain, evidence from just about every country, even China now. Yeah.
Next question.
I just wanted to. I know Hugh's work, and so there's something that he hasn't mentioned that I think contributes to this discussion, and that has to do with the importance of professional or occupational differentials. People within the same occupational category are paid very differently. So there are lawyers who make $25,000 a year, and there are lawyers who make $5 million a year. It's one of the reasons for which statistics comparing educational levels at the global level don't have much meaning. If you put Bill Gates in a room, then the average is going to look pretty good.
Can I make a comment on it, or is it a comment rather?
Well, just to say that I think Hal's point is very important, because what I'm trying to get at throughout this, and perhaps I didn't make it very clear, is that the labour market has fundamentally changed. So you've got those people at the top, your lawyers, your Bill Gateses, and you've got a lot of people beneath that who are, not only is the work stratified, but we look at engineering, for example, and what you conjecture from that is that you've got your Apple engineers who are, part of the core workforce. We're going back to segmented labour markets, I think, but part of the core workforce. And then you've got other engineers who are crowdsourcing projects from Apple, but they'll get very little money, they'll get very variable money for that. We're looking at a very different kind of labour market from the 50s, 60s and 70s. And I think that's one of the points that I'm trying to make. That makes life so much more complex and difficult.
So, no one theory explains all of it.
No.
So, and my current major collaboration is with a very good sociologist at Stanford, Sean Reardon, from whom I'm learning a great deal. But I also think, though, that I think the economic framework helps you understand a lot of these patterns. I mean, the one reason why you see lawyers' salaries for great lawyers falling is that a lot of lawyers get paid to search documents in civil suits. That can now be done electronically.
By machine, absolutely.
And so then it's important to ask that, well, what are computers not so good at? Because computers get better every year. They get faster and less costly, and the neural net stuff is really quite amazing. As you see, if you shop on Amazon or anything, and you get these recommendations to buy new stuff. What computers are not good at is working with each other to solve unstructured problems. Humans, well trained, do that quite well. And I think that, and this is where Frank Levy and Dave Lauder and I started, and David Deming is the center of his work. So I think that has really quite important implications for thinking about education. It's these, if you think about the way most of the world's interesting work is done, you talk to other people. You don't know the whole piece yourself. If you're good at organizing meetings, and too many people aren't, you actually can have outcomes of meetings that are better than what you get if each person worked individually. So I think really that has very powerful implications for thinking about what education and training ought to look like, because those are the kinds of jobs, as well as, of course, jobs that you can't outsource. The plumbers are going to always be local. That's important in thinking about. So I think that framework of skills, but you got to think about it more broadly, much more broadly than tests on standardized tests, and that's one of the challenges. We don't know how to measure these kinds of things like the ability to work productively in groups that matter, and that you can teach.
Somebody over here had a hand up. Was it Nancy?
Yeah, I was making a comment from several comments back when Bob was talking about what skills you need. There's also a major class and race barrier in this country, which I assume also exists in the UK, which is that, so at a community college near here, and this is a phenomenon everywhere, every position in the nursing program is filled by someone who already has a bachelor's degree and work experience and is generally well networked and has the social capital to know that this is a good thing to do and how I'm going to get a job. So that's another piece of this picture that's missing. That is, two people may have the same credentials, but if they don't have a social network, I mean, even if a computer is reading their resume, they still need to know where to apply and whom to call and all of those kinds of things. And so that's, so you can even differentiate on the basis of race and class beyond the skills available. I have another question, but we might take this up later. Is what are your recommendations for what to do about this?
And I think you had your hand up. Sorry. Did your hand up or not? No, it wasn't.
Yeah, I did.
It was, okay. And then you. Then you, please. Go on.
So if the solution is to train people to do things that computers cannot as well, such as working in teams and general just like softer social skills that we found are like important.
They're complements to knowing some science.
Right.
Not substitutes.
Until machines can then do the things that we are training people to like do now. What if any sense do any of you have on the ability of employers then to distinguish between these soft skills that if we were going to form the basis of our education policy on, we would have to assume that they would have to distinguish between a really large number of people. Like you can say like a consulting firm that, they can handle the 50 people that might apply and put them through like 5-hour case interviews. But if someone's if a machine is reading your resume, like how do you put that across? And what does that have to, like it seems like at the end of the day, then we're still going to be working with some really like poor signals, and then the people with the networks and pedigree are going to be able to just have access to the jobs that they would have anyway.
That opens up an interesting point I wanted to make earlier, which is that, in fact, I heard Alison Wolfe, you guys probably know, give a talk in England. She's it's maybe the most prominent researcher in this field in England. She talked about the total collapse of the youth labor market in England, which is very much a point that Nancy and I and others who do this work here point out. The reason I mentioned that, I mean, for one thing, first is that the bottom has totally fallen out of the youth labor market. If your family earns $150,000 or more, you're 3 times more likely to have access to work as a teenager than if your family earns $25,000 or less. If you ask, where do you learn the so-called soft skills, those, in my view, are not things that can effectively be taught in classrooms. They are learned at workplaces, but workplaces that are structured to support the development of those skills. And so, the question you raise is, if we don't have a strategy for actually enabling young people, from a pretty early age to actually develop those skills and get some form of certification in effect, that I've completed a 6-week internship in the summer, I was paid, and my employer says I was good at working in teams, I knew how to respond to supervision, I was able to solve problems that were not immediately apparent, et cetera, et cetera. That's one thing. But if we're going to depend on resumes, and your resume has a blank when it comes to work experience, you're at the back of the queue. The people who are in the most trouble in this society, and we now have 5.5 million 16 to 24-year-olds who are neither at work nor in school. As you might guess, they are disproportionately poor and they're disproportionately black and brown. And the reason I'm thinking about 16 to 24 is the point is, if you arrive at 20 or 21 and you only have a high school diploma, or worse yet, don't even have that, and you don't have a resume with work experience, you are at the back of the hiring queue, and it would take some kind of miracle to enable you to move. So my point is, if we can't figure out, earlier I was making the case about exposing kids to the world of careers, I would add to that, if we can't get employers to engage with schools to actually provide actual work experience, ideally in a structured way, internship, while we still have kids, before we lose them at 17 or 18, they're not going to get it on their own unless they're extremely, lucky or fortunate. And that's a huge, think about both the social costs of that, the economic costs, and ultimately the human cost to the kids and their families.
One quick comment. So the other piece that we haven't talked about is macroeconomic policy. We have insufficient demand. This is a point Paul Krugman has made many times in his articles. Yes, the unemployment rate is down at about 5.1%, but if you look at the employment to population ratio, it is extremely low. Because remember, the employment rate is number of people employed divided by the number of people employed plus the number of people looking for work. So if you stop looking for work, you're not in the denominator. What happens is when the economy gets better, people move from out of the labor force into looking for work. So I think we need now, the Federal Reserve did exactly the right thing earlier this week in not raising interest rates. But clearly there's not a whole lot more the Fed can do in terms of monetary policy. We need a much more aggressive fiscal policy. As Larry Summers has pointed out on a number of occasions, I think very pointed out, when interest rates as low as they are, and we have a country whose physical infrastructure is in absolutely terrible shape, we should be making massive investments in improving our infrastructure, which would provide lots of jobs. And teenagers are always the last hired. African American and Hispanic teachers are the very last hired. You need a much stronger demand in order to move those numbers.
Well, I think on the point of praising Larry Summers, which is an unusual I think we should thank we have run out of time, thank the speakers very much for provocative comments. Thank you very much for your comments as well.